Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, How to Identify Application Level Security Attacks. I am Ritika Chakraborty and I will be your host for the day. Our speaker for the day is Subin Tayil Kandi, Senior Product Security Engineer at Salesforce. Please note the session will be in listen only mode and will last for 40 minutes, out of which last 10 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. Requesting all the participants to post your questions in the Q&A window. Should you need any assistance during the session, please use the chat box. Also, we do have two criterias for certification. One is attend the complete webinar to become eligible. And the second one is fill in the survey and give the right answer to the three questions based on the webinar on the same day. Now, about our speaker, Subin Tailekandi. He is a seasoned security professional with more than a decade of experience in application security and offensive security. He currently works for Salesforce as a senior product security engineer and works on continually evolving his penetration testing skills. He has worked for several banking and financial organizations like Barclays and Capital One, spanning both defensive and offensive security roles, and enjoys every aspect of it. During his consulting roles with Verizon, he led several offensive security engagements and advised clients on improving their threat landscape and building a better security posture. He holds several certifications like CEH and GIAC. I would now hand over the session to you, Mr. Subin.
Yep, awesome. Thank you, Ritika. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm super excited to be here and talking to you all today. So we are going to be doing some deep dive into application security attacks and application security concept in particular. So we all know that attacks are techniques that attackers use to exploit vulnerabilities in application, to break into the application or to hack into the application. And web app attacks are still the most prominent or most frequent seen attacks today because of the sheer attack surface and DC accessibility for it. So as applications grow in size and complexity, so does the attack surface and attack vectors. For example, if you think some 10, 12 years back, where you had to do some banking and you need to transfer some money, you'd have a website where you'd have to register and to transfer the money, or you would have to go to the bank. Today, you have mobile apps, contactless payment options. You could pay with your fingerprint. You could pay with your Face ID. You could pay with your selfie. MasterCard even lets you pay with your selfie. So if you look at Verizon data breach investigation report that came out recently for 2020, 45% of the attacks are still attacks that happen on the application layer, or what they categorize as application hacking, where it would be some vulnerabilities within the application that needs to be exploited. And 80% among those attacks are involved with brute force or lost and stolen credentials. So let's look into that statistics a bit more. So yeah, so 80% of them are stolen credentials being tried into websites. What that means is that there would be a dump of credentials that are available from previous attacks that the attackers would download and try it on all the other websites. So if you were a registered user on that website that was breached, and you're reusing your credentials, then chances are that those credentials will work and the attackers will be able to get in. So that's a quick win and quick monetization for the attackers that they easily go after. So the remaining would be about exploiting vulnerabilities within the application, abusing functionality and all that. And the vulnerability is being exploited. If we take a deeper look into that, they're mainly SQL injection being the most prominent one, followed by PHP injection, cross-site scripting, local file injection, and all that. So if you look at the attacks observed by Akamai between previous weeks, between Feb 7th and Feb 14th, SQL injection is still the most prominent one, followed by remote file inclusion and cross-site scripting. So this is the attacks that are observed. It doesn't mean that these were successful. Whereas in the previous slide, it was about confirmed exploited vulnerabilities. So that's why there's a difference in numbers between the two slides. As you can see, the cross-site scripting is more here because there are lots of bots that attempt cross-site scripting, whereas they may not be really successful. So the point here is that these attacks, like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, which has been around for years, are still very prominent and very much applicable today. So moving on about identifying the application attacks, we could employ several techniques and processes throughout our secure development lifecycle to identify the attacks, both manual and automated. For example, right from requirements phase, you could make it a requirement to have CAPTCHA, which would prevent some of the brute force attacks. Or you could make strong requirements for input validation and output validation, which should mitigate some of the attacks like cross-site scripting and some injection attacks. In design phase, we could do threat modeling, do security architecture reviews, and employ strict coding standards and design patterns review in development phase. And during testing phase, we could do pen testing, vulnerability assessment. We can even have automated tools run throughout the CI/CD pipeline, which would look at code, which would do code scans or dynamic scans, and even third-party components that needs to be analyzed for vulnerabilities. So in deployment phase, you could make sure your deployment is secure. You could also do a threat model separately for your deployment process. And then once the application goes live, you would maintain it, monitor the logs to make sure it's healthy and all that. So we'll focus on two main concepts here, which I think have been more effective in my experience in identifying attacks, which is threat modeling and pen testing. So threat modeling fundamentally involves thinking about what, when, and how things can go wrong. And it's a process of simulating attacks and analyzing threats, where it involves envisioning the attacks and the results of certain attacks on the application. And eventually coming up with a set of attacks that your application or your system would be vulnerable from, and that needs to be and needs some work to be done to mitigate it. And testing is a common concept. It's an ethical hacking exercise where we would assume the role of a hacker and break into the application. It helps security teams identify security issues and prioritize what are more relevant issues, because it involves actual exploitation. Um, uh, you could risk rate it accordingly, and that means it would take into consideration the effort needed to exploit it, the impact, the actual impact that it can cause, and then how easy it was to exploit. So all that would go into when you create the risk rating for that. So based on that, you could decide which of them are more relevant and what needs to be fixed. So doing that model upfront or as part of the pen testing is a good method to make sure the test is more complete and more relevant to your business. And we'll get into some of those topics later in the slides. Let's focus on some of the threat modeling concepts and how we go about doing that now. So thinking about what can, so threat modeling is basically thinking about what can go wrong, so we can do something about it before they go wrong. And thinking about what can go wrong, it's something we do in our daily lives. For example, if you think about going out to get groceries, and if the weather is gloomy or cloudy, you would want to grab an umbrella because you don't want to get wet. And these days you would also wear a mask, right? So these are all threat modeling. So applying that to applications and systems that you work with, these processes help improve security and the software in general by understanding the security requirements upfront, assessing the risk, calling out the security controls we have, and if they are effective enough for the threats that we are talking about, and device mitigations against it. It helps identifying threats and bugs early because it's very expensive to fix it later once the applications go live or later um, during the phase. So this is typically done even before one line of code is done during the design phase. Ultimately, it helps engineers deliver better products, better secure products. So how we go about doing it, it mainly goes into asking 4 questions, like as described by Adam Shostak. So first one being, what are we building? This is where we describe what are we building using architecture diagrams, DFDs, components, sequence diagrams, whatnot, as much as possible to describe the system in detail. And then we go into what can go wrong, which is where we think like an attacker and brainstorm evil. As an attacker, you would envision what all the attacks you would try on that application or those data flows. And we would call out each of those threads using one of those methodologies like Stride or Pasta. There are several different methodologies. We could choose one based on our business and industry. The next one being, what are we going to do about it? This is where we call out the mitigations for the threats assessed in the previous phase. This is where you would create user stories, bugs, define accept criteria or definition of done on what we are going to do about the threats identified. Final step would be about, did we do a good job, which is more like a sprint retrospective, where you would review the whole threat model that was done, ensure there was enough coverage, did we have enough time to do it, how could have it been better, what areas took more time, and how could those time be minimized in future. So threat modeling is a time-intensive exercise, and you want to minimize the time and make sure everybody that's engaged is making the best out of it. So how we go about building it, well, on what are we building step, it mainly involves creating detailed diagrams that are clean, crisp, and precise for user to understand. And then think about that, it may not always be the technical folks or engineers who are going to look at these diagrams. It may also be risk management or sometimes leadership or business executives who look at it. Because when you go to them and say, hey, this is why you want to fix this vulnerability, they would need to understand why. And they might have to go through these diagrams as well to understand what's going on. And so make sure it's as detailed as possible. Um, and call out all the trust boundaries and the data flows as shown on the screen. So this is what you're seeing on screen is basically a DFD diagram for a sample blogging site where you can see the website is hosted in AWS. It stores all the data in database. We have clearly marked out the internet trust boundary. So the user would access the website and he would get redirected to Google, sign in. Well, after successful authentication, Google would provide a token and the user would go with that token to log in. The website will again go and verify that token with Google. Once that's verified, the user is in, and he'll be able to read and update the blogs. But pay attention to all the protocols that is defined and numbered, because we'll be using this for threat modeling in later phases. So about threat enumeration and the next step, where we think about what can go wrong. There are several methodologies, Stride being the most simple and common one. Stride stands for spoofing, tampering, reputation, information disclosure, denial of service, and privilege escalation. Spoofing is pretending or assuming another user's identity. It can be spoofing someone's SMS, spoofing calls, um, spoofing requests, being man in the middle, and all that. Tampering is where an attacker would modify uh, input parameters, components, or code to cause harm. It can even be physical, from a mere lockpicking activity to break into a data center, or modifying or sideloading some of the DLLs or libraries, like what we saw during the SolarWinds attack. Reputation is about somebody denying they did something. Like, for example, a customer would come and say that and deny that they made a payment or they even logged into the application, and it involves having enough track of logs and events to support that claim, or to go and validate that. Information disclosure is about leaking informations, not restricting access to sensitive data, and the data being leaked in logs or on the website itself. It can be your geographical location, your personal data, which leads to privacy issues and all that. The next being denial of service, where a service would get overwhelmed, a service or resource would get overwhelmed, eventually causing it to come down. It can be batteries in case of IoT devices, your computing resources, your cloud resources, which eventually boils down to cloud budget. Yep, basically, and bandwidth, which might cause performance issues in responding, and eventually the whole database or the service to go down. Right, so all attacks related to that would fall into this category. And privilege escalation would be around an attacker gaining more privileges, either horizontally or vertically. That means either getting access as another user or gaining more access like an admin or something. It could be from a hidden admin panel that was discovered on the application, or fixing cookies, where you would just set a cookie to admin and the application now starts treating you as an admin. Yep. PASTA is more of an attack-centric and risk-centric methodology, where we define all business objectives up front, and all threat modeling is done around the objectives and scope or context. So context is very important here, and that comes from threat analysis and threat intelligence. So threat intelligence teams would provide intelligence around your industry and applications and attacks that are common to your application. For example, if you think about MITRE framework would have um, details around adversaries or APT groups that target a specific industry, and the TTPs they follow. TTPs is tactics, techniques, and procedures, which means basically the steps they follow in attacking an application. And the whole threat model is done around that. It's more time intensive and cost intensive. So Stride would be done typically with an engineering team and a few developers, and then security team at the most, architecture folks. Pasta on the other side would involve a lot more folks, including the network engineering folks who built out your cloud, even business. It's a lot more other teams, and that makes it a little more time consuming and hard to get all the right people in the session. So pick one based on what works for you, but at least do Stride. There are other methodologies like DRED, CVSs, Octave, NIST, and CAPEC. CAPEC is common attack pattern enumeration. So that talks more about attack patterns rather than actual attacks. So that's the least technical. So if you have to involve executives or non-technical folks in threat modeling, that would be the right one to go with. So now that we have got all the threats for that system, now let's talk about the mitigation. So if you think about the if you go back and think about the diagram where the user's logging in, uh, see those numbered points where user would make a request at 1, get a response at 2, go back to Google sign in for 3. So keep that in mind, and mm, we'll note down the threats and mitigations for each of those data flows. So the DFD locations you would mark the DFD locations, whether it's 1, 3, and 5 being the external internet uh, exposure where the user would access the website. The 3 is the request that it makes to Google, and 5 is the response that comes from Google. So then we talk about all the attacks that can happen on those locations. So starting with if you're following Stride, then we would start with spoofing, where an attacker tries to pretend like a different user using this identity, and we talk about what are the mitigations. Mitigations can be HTTPS encrypted channel, MTLS. I mean, not MTLS in case of public website, but depending on our application, that may be another mitigation as well. Multi-factor authentications, signature validations, and all that. Tampering, again, it checks integrity. Some of the mitigations could be HTTPS permissions, checking digital signatures, meaning you could take a hash of the whole request and make sure it's not modified on the server side. Reputation, having enough logs and auditing capabilities goes, and information disclosure. Mitigations being permissions, ACL. In case of logs, you could define permissions, what users are allowed to access the logs, and encryption. Depending on the standards you follow, you might need to encrypt data in rest and transit, which would eventually mean that you would also have to encrypt the logs or customer data. Denial of service, there could be mitigations like WAF, defining input validation, again, some permissions within cloud access boundaries, and load balancing, and then defining your strict quotas and all, which should prevent denial of service attacks. Elevation of privilege, this could have mitigations like input validation, strong authorization checks, again, permission checks. So this is how it looks like. And for each of those mitigations, you could, uh, if we could think about if that is good enough, and if not, you could um, create bugs or user stories that would be used to mitigate that. So the final step being thinking about did we do a good job, which is more like retrospective, where we would uh, focus on how we could improve, especially around the time spent on those attacks. So we'll think about was that if there was areas where we spend a lot of time because of the diagram um, not being complete and having to go multiple times with their developer teams or other folks who provided the diagrams. We could look into how we could minimize that time. Did we have all the right teams engaged? Was the scope clear upfront, or what we can do to minimize some of these issues and get the threat modeling done sooner, making the best use of everybody's time. So talking about pen testing, I won't go much into this because it's a general topic, and it involves testing and validating anything that can potentially go wrong that we had identified, and then determining the actual risk and impact of that exploitation. Like I said, this involves actual exploitation, and you would note down the exploitability of it, the ease of exploitation, and mitigating factors that would prevent, and all that would go into the risk assessment, which would give it a more relevant risk rating. And you could do that to fix. You could use that risk rating to go back to your leadership and say, "Hey, this critical and needs to be fixed because of these reasons." Right? So doing a threat model upfront, either before a pen testing or as part of it, uh, uh, helps with understanding of the application data flow and provide better scope and value. It makes it more relevant to the application. And as a pen tester, it would help cut down a lot of time. So most pen testing frameworks and methodologies, or if you think about it, it talks about discovery phase or recon phase. So recon phase is usually where the threat modeling is done. Or if it's a third party engagement and you're engaging a third party to do it, there would be scoping calls where you would define your work, and it's a common practice to do the threat modeling there as well and ask a lot of questions and figure out what's important to the company, what's important to the industry, so the pen testing focuses more on that area, and they don't get sidetracked into other areas. Basically, it scopes the pen testing around what's more important to the industry and what keeps them awake at night, basically giving it more value when we do it. So threat modeling can also serve like an attack tree or a checklist of items that you need to follow during the pen testing. So if you get lost at some point, you know exactly where to get back to. Um, so some of the further references that I've listed here, I'm not sure if you'd get the slides, but you can go through some of them, maybe take a screenshot or something. There are a lot of resources out there. And there's also an OWASP Slack channel on threat modeling where you can join to get more details. And with that, we are done. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Subin. Uh,
Mm.
for the audience, actually, we are launching a poll question.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, the Q&A. So we have so many questions actually. So I'm starting the Q&A session, Subin. So
Mhm.
first question is, what is the best threat modeling approach?
I mean, it really depends on what suits your development life cycle and what suits your industry. Everything has different pros and cons. If you're doing, if your whole setup is more collaborative and have a lot of different folks attending, then probably PASTA has the right approach, which gives more of an attack-centric and more relevant way of threat modeling. But if time is really a constraint and you're just threat modeling with your engineering and few folks from security teams and maybe two stride, if you're already doing that, you could try one of the other and then see what works for you. But if you're not doing anything, at least get into stride so you get a good hang of it before you transition over to any of the other methods. Yep.
Okay. The second question is, there are two questions together. What is the best way to automate the threat modeling process? And how do you cut down on the time intensive nature of the process for development teams?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of it.
Okay, what is the best way to automate the threat modeling process? And
Mhm.
how do you cut down on the time intensive nature of the process for development teams?
Got it. Yeah, so I don't think you actually want to automate threat model. There are some aspects of threat modeling that can be automated around that, but the actual threat model, it's better to be done with in a collaborative session in a meeting where there would be security folks and developers and all that. Um but to cut down the time, a lot of it can be done by you could create something like a security champions team within your engineering folks who would help with threat modeling. So developers can work with them upfront to do some of the threat modeling before it comes to the security or other teams are engaged. So by the time they can make sure that the DFD is complete or all the information required to do threat model is available, and they could start noting down some of the threats and mitigations as well. So you would be able to complete the threat model with the security teams in just one session or something. And advocating this within the developer teams and doing some mock trainings and all would definitely help. So the engineering teams are completely on board with what is happening during the threat modeling session, and they come prepared for. Yep.
Okay. Uh, the next question is, could you please give a brief information of DREAD and NIST?
So Red is again um, similar to Stride, where you talk about different attacks and then you give a rating for it. It's very similar to Stride, where will be denial of service and all those reputation and all that would come into it. NIST is again similar. Again, all these are similar approaches. There isn't much difference in those. I don't think NIST is much used today. The most commonly used ones are either the Dread or Stride. More commonly Stride, and PASTA is gaining a lot more focus today because of threat intelligence and frameworks like MITRE and kill chains and all that. And PASTA blends in very neatly with those frameworks. Meaning, for a framework like MITRE, you could say that for these attack techniques and this is the threat model, or you could associate it to um, uh, to an adversary group or the TTPs that they follow. So that's why the PASTA is gaining more importance. I haven't done much on NIST or DRED actually, but if that works for you, yeah, definitely please feel free to go ahead and use it.
Okay. Next one is, what are the different encryption tools that are used in real time at SOCs?
You mean SOC, like a cyber
Yes,
response SOC? Is
yes,
that
yes, yeah.
uh, SOC is basically a team that handles cyber response activities or constantly monitoring logs and um, so if your question, I assume, is around the information disclosure part, which we said where you would encrypt the logs. And I think your question is around what are the common encryption methodologies used. I mean, it can be anything. I mean, anything like PGP, as long as it's not something that takes more time to decrypt. It could be as simple like an RC4 encryption because it's within your organization and you're just trying to make sure only the right teams, that is your SOC or the right people, is able to access it within your team. So it's just an additional layer of protection around it. I wouldn't go too much into any space. I mean, there are different encryption algorithms which are good for certain scenarios, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. It can be anything. I would choose something that's faster, maybe a stream cipher, which would be really faster compared to something that needs more computing resources and all that.
Okay. Next one is, share the names of a few good DevScopes tools.
I'm not sure if I got the question. Demscope? What was that?
Maybe it is written incorrectly from the audience. We are moving to
Demscope? Yeah.
DevScopes.
Oh, DevScope. You mean tools what the developers could use to find? I mean, there can be tools like
It's a DevSecOps, Subin.
oh, DevSecOps. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought actually. So DevSecOps tools, uh, Jenkins is a common DevSecOps tools. There can be other orchestration frameworks like that, which automates the pipeline, and then you can add your security checks on top of that. Jenkins is the most common one. You can have other things like Go, and there are also several other open source frameworks out there. There is one by Coinbase which they use, which is quite good. It's an open source one which you can download and kick it off if you don't want to spend so much time or money on Jenkins. But Jenkins is neat where you could plug in all third-party tools like HP45 or Checkmark for code scanning, Sonatype or Snyk for third-party tools, and you can even kick off some dynamic scans from Jenkins. Yep.
Okay. Next question is, where does the approach fall under gray box, white box, and black box?
So between gray box, white box, and black box, the difference basically in what information you have um, and what threat modeling you can do with it, right? So with black box, where you have the least amount of information, where it would be just saying that, hey, here's a system, here's the URL, or here's the IPs, and then just go hit it. When you do your discovery phase and recon phase, you can, with as much information available, you can start with the threat modeling. And as you go down and you discover more items, you can come back and update the threat model and go along with it. But in tests like gray box, white box, and crystal box, where you have much more information, including sometimes access to the code, you can do a lot more. You can even look at the some of the mitigations that are employed by the application. You can even you might even have access to all the DFD diagrams and sequence diagrams or architecture diagrams that the system is architectured with. Um, Sometimes even access to your bug system like Jira or something. So you can even look at all the past issues that came up and then think of attack patterns from those perspectives. Like these are the attacks or these are the vulnerabilities that was there. Was that resolved enough? Was the mitigations put in for that? Is it good enough? And all?
Uh, Next is, please refer some best tools for analysis. Yeah, analysis.
For analyzing what actually?
This is the only, like, this is the question they have written. Maybe it's incomplete. So we are moving to the next one. Can you share more points regarding cloud penetration testing?
So cloud pen testing, I mean, basically it's similar to like if you're a pen tester and if you're all into pen testing, what changes with cloud is that now you have now all your data and applications are hosted at a third party, and everything is managed by ACLs, like permissions on what can access what. Uh, and you have to think about your standards that you need to follow, whether it be HIPAA or FDIC, PCI, if you need to do data encryption at rest, encryption in transit, um, and another aspect that would be important to look at is about DDoS attacks and how you could drain some of the cloud resources, making sure it hit the quota and then eventually becoming not accessible. So depending on how the quotas are set, you may be able to deface a website or bring it down or make it slow and all that. Apart from that, depending on what technologies are used in cloud, as you would model, you would list all them down. They can be um, Kubernetes clusters, so you would have to look into breaking out of each of them. Um, you would try, breaking out of each of the boxes, trying to access any other entities that you're not supposed to access or any other customers boxes and all that. The methodologies aren't much different, but the attack vectors and the would are a lot different, and things that you would focus on also changes a bit. But your basic approach of testing and exploiting all remains the same. So a lot more focus would be given on access keys and tokens because everything is based on that. So if you are able to enumerate um, metadata surveys and get more access tokens and access something, so all those additional things go on to it. You also have to look into your ingress egress gateways and what security that's providing. Most people might just do clear text communication once it's past the ingress, and you'll have to think about the threats and attacks that you can do there. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about in that topic. It's a whole different session on itself, but these are some of the things that you can look at. But yeah, your approach or the testing methodology does not change, just the attack vectors and the attack surface changes with clouds.
Okay. The next one is it possible to authenticate app logging through Office 365? If yes, how?
App login through Office 365. I'm not very familiar with that concept. I'm sorry. That's not somewhat relevant to the topic. If I would guess, yeah, but you would have to talk to some of the Microsoft Azure experts on how that can be done. And I'm not familiar with that. Sorry.
Okay. Next one is when we look at URI paths in the web logs, what are the suspicious looking requests?
When you look at URI path or URLs, if you see any payloads being added to the URL and end of the URL or in parameters or even any code, any injection attempts, that would be an indication of injection attempts. If you see a large volume of requests coming from an IP or a set of IPs, that would be someone trying. If it's login, it could mean that someone is trying credential validation attacks or DDoS against your website. If you see a request coming in from an IP, they logged in, and then all of a sudden you're seeing that session ID being used by another IP address, that would mean session hijacking. Yeah, there can be a lot of suspicious things like that that you want to look out for. They can be sensitive. You can also look out for any sensitive data in the logs, make sure they're not there. Yeah, basically any payloads that are in the request which are not supposed to be there would mean indication of any attack that someone is trying. Yep.
Okay. Next is what is the best way to introduce threat modeling to developers?
To introduce threat modeling to developers, best way would be to have a session, to have a hands-on exercise where you pick one of the applications that you uh, um, have the engineers come up with DFD diagrams, very clean and crispy DFD diagrams or sequence diagrams if that's not already there, and then um, start with stride because that's the most easy and clear one. That would be more uh, clear to engineering, more clear to developer teams. So you could start with stride and start noting down all the threats, think like an attacker, and then start noting down all the various type of attacks that can happen, all the mitigations, and then then go to these security teams and they can review it for you. They can even have several hands-on sessions, so the developer teams are more hands-on and engaged with it. They can, like I said, they can also create a team, like a team of security champions within the developer teams, which are more security savvy, or which helps with more of the security aspects around the application. And they can be the point of contact, and they can be trained to do threat modeling. So that way, the developer teams do not have to go to security team for each and everything, and they can get everything ready upfront with the security engineering teams as well. That way, it saves a lot of time, and make sure everything is complete by the time you're in a session with the security team, and probably you would be able to complete the whole threat modeling in just one session, depending on the application.
Okay. So one of our attendee asked regarding pen testing, should I work with my team to pen test applications on our own or work through an external bug bounty program?
That's a good question. It really depends on the maturity of your application and where you are. Right. Sometimes all you may need is probably, I mean, you want to be at a good level before you engage a third party or a bug bounty. You don't want to end up paying a lot of money with bug bounties, with the community finding a lot more issues that you didn't think of. So to answer your question, you would want to do some testing and validation on it before you go about the bug bounty route. So you could either have your security teams do a good pen testing on it, or you could do it yourself, and then call out the issues, make sure you fix them before you go the bug bounty route. You can follow some of the methodologies and processes out there for pen testing, but mainly it's about trying out all the attacks. You could use threat modeling as part of it. Note down all the attacks that you would want to try, and then if there are some sections that you're not familiar with, or how or you're not familiar with those type of attacks, you could note them down, or have someone else in your team, um, or the security team do that for you. But definitely, yeah, do some testing or validation yourself or within your organization before you go out with the bug bounty route.
Okay, this is our last question. How does threat modeling and the enterprise identity and access management program can work together?
So that's a good question, right? So how it works together is that for some of the threats that you call out, like um, let's say you have an application where you would first request access to the enterprise access thing, and then once you get access, and you access it. So some of the threats that whether it is tampering, information disclosure, so all those would have this as one of the mitigation, meaning you need to first request and get access before you're able to get in. So your access is vetted by a team before you're even allowed to have access. So some of the threats, so this it can be a mitigation to most of the threats, and then you can go about thinking if that is good enough. And meaning, is the enterprise access request process robust enough or good enough? Meaning, does that have somebody really vetting you, or making sure that you really need that access, asking why you really need that access? There are other ways you could do the same thing without that access and all that. Or if it's just merely asking somebody and they'll give it to you. So you can, if that's the case, then you could improve that. That is not a good mitigation for any of the threats. So you could talk about how you could improve that, which would mean that you would work with the enterprise identity and access management teams to make robust access requirements, whether it be tokens, auth, characteristics, whatever needs to be changed to make it more secure and robust. For example, you might be doing OAuth with a UUID format token, which might expose you to some threats, but you would want to use JOT or a JWT token instead, which prevents against tampering. So things like that. Depending on what all areas come under scope of the identity access management, you can uh, first talk about threats, then look at mitigations, and mitigations that fall in the identity and access management area. Think about if that's good enough, if that is actually robust enough to prevent those attacks, or as you're evolving, do you want to add more controls and checks in there? And if that does, then you can keep adding. For example, you may be storing your certificates um, on a physical system protected by root or protected by permissions. Uh, you could use HSM if that's something you want to do, which would involve you have to buy a hardware security module, which involves more money. But these are some of the areas where enterprise and access team management can weigh in. You could think about the risk for the organization, and then think about what benefits it'll bring in, and think of the cost and overhead involved in managing an HSM, and if it makes sense to you to bring that in. So all those can be done by working closely with that team. So I hope I answered that. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, we have so many more questions lined up, but we are
That's okay.
running out of our time. Pardon? Hello?
Um, okay. Yeah, I mean, I thought we had a few moments, but yeah, if you want to run some questions, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm good.
Yeah.
Again, you can. Yep, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so we are requesting all the participants, all the attendees to write the question to us through email, and we will pass it to the speaker, and we will revert you back.
Yep. All right. Yep. Thank you. It was nice talking to you all. I hope you learned something with today's talk. Uh, Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your time, and hope to see you somewhere in some conference or say hi in LinkedIn. Thank you. Have a good day, folks.
Thank you so much, Subin, once again.
Thank you. Thanks.
It
Bye-bye.
it was an interesting and enlightening session.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Do visit our website for upcoming webinar details. You may now disconnect your lines. Thank you.
Thank you.